Thanks, Iftikhar. It's really a pleasure to introduce Dr. Waqas Butt, an anthropologist at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, whose work focuses on the intersections of caste, labor, infrastructures, and waste in urban Pakistan. Waqas's long-term ethnographic fieldwork is in Lahore and the Punjab, and his current book project examines the ways that waste workers, who are drawn predominantly from so-called low or non-caste or Dalit groups, have become essential components of urban life through the everyday and intimate workings of waste infrastructures. His research on stigmatized labor and urbanization has been funded by the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, and the University of California at San Diego. His work has appeared in academic journals such as City, American Ethnologist, among others, as well as newspapers and magazines in Pakistan. And we're going to invite Dr. Butt to give about a 35-minute talk, after which we'll open it to some questions that you can post in the chat. And thank you and welcome, Waqas.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen really quickly. So hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so thank you, Natasha, for that introduction, as well as for moderating the discussion afterwards. So I'd, of course, like to thank the South Asia program here at Cornell University for hosting my talk, Iftikhar Dadi and Daniel Bass for inviting me, and then Gloria Lemus Chavez for arranging the logistics of the talk. It's also nice to see familiar names, at least in the chat or participants list, so that's really nice. Today I'll be drawing upon materials from the book manuscript I'm currently finalizing, tentatively titled Reproducing Lahore, Waste and the Work of Infrastructures in Urban Pakistan. As a way of contextualizing the talk, my broader projects, in addition to what Natasha laid out, my broader project takes the work surrounding waste materials as a vantage point from which to examine how the city of Lahore, its institutions, infrastructures, and life has come to be organized and transformed across historical moments. Today, in particular, I'll be tracing how informal economies have been organized to supply waste materials for commodity production. So I'm predominantly focusing on informality as an economic form linking capitalist economies and uneven urbanization. So the talk consists of mainly two parts. After a brief ethnographic vignette in the first part of the talk, I address caste in both Pakistan and the historical region of central Punjab. This discussion will be used to make clear how caste, class, and to a lesser extent religion have converged as uneven urbanization has unfolded in Lahore over the past several decades. In the second half of the talk, I unpack informality as an economic form through what I call figures of surplus. These figures refer to how surpluses in a variety of forms are generated as waste materials are supplied as a resource for commodity production. Since many of you may be wondering, I'll be explaining what I exactly mean by surpluses as the talk proceeds. In any case, with that preface, I thank you all for joining me today. Yeah. A haphazard structure made of repurposed wood and blue tarp, Umar's junkyard is located between an upper middle class settlement and a working class basti. Whenever I visited Umar, a range of customers would be regularly passing through. Young children and older women carried all kinds of household waste to sell for extra cash, plastic bottles, old newspapers and school notebooks, card and tin boxes, and compact discs. Domestic staff from more affluent households hauled similar items, but ones that would be considered higher quality and in larger amounts. Then there were those sanitation workers, informal workers, and janitorial staff from a nearby hospital whom Umar had given advances to. No more than a couple thousand rupees, these advances ensured those who are given them sold the collected materials only to Umar. In this junkyard, unlike the others I conducted fieldwork in, Umar sorted and disassembled waste materials himself. On one of my first visits, for instance, I peeked into a bag so full of waste that it had taken on a rectangular shape and asked Umar what kinds of plastics are in here. This bag, Umar told me, contained mixed goods, daramal, that had not yet been sorted, while another bag in the back contained only sorted waste, specifically PET bottles with the caps removed. The mixed goods will be split into higher quality and more expensive soft mal, literally clean goods, and lower quality and less expensive kala mal, or literally black goods. Sensing doubt on my end, Umair pulled out multiple pieces to hand to me. "Can't you see?" he asked emphatically. I responded affirmatively, but also said, "Still, how do you recognize the difference between soft mal and kala mal?" Breaking off a piece of plastic, Umair placed it in a bucket of water. The first piece of plastic remained afloat. This was soft mal. The next piece sunk to the bottom. This was kala mal. Each of these items would fetch different rates among middlemen or bīopārīan who purchase and take these materials away. In fact, many of the items in Umair's junkyard will be taken away to warehouses like the ones ran by Ali Bhai and his brothers, who are themselves middlemen dealing mostly with paper waste. A few days before Umair's explanation of the different plastics, Ali Bhai had given me a tour of several warehouses and manufacturing units located on Band Road, which, along with the locality of Shadra across the river Ravi, is a major manufacturing center for plastics. We first walked into one warehouse where several workers were separating all white plastic bags from those with color, and then the ones with color printing were being cut to separate the all white portions of the shopper. In the next warehouse, sorted plastics were being shredded into smaller pieces, washed in chemicals and water, and dried on the roof. We then made our way over to a manufacturing unit close by. The smell of melted plastics permeated its dimly lit basement, and two sinewy young men weaved through low-hanging wiring as they operated the pellet-making machinery. Shredded plastic was put into a spinning cauldron that further dried and softened the materials. Once ready, the heated shreddings were fed into a pipe underneath which ran a rod burner lit gas that melted the shreddings inside. Taking several hours, the melted plastic extrudes out as several strings through the end of the pipe, falling into a pool of water. Cooling and solidifying, these materials were broken into sections and passed through another machinery that cut them into pellets. Finally, we visited another nearby unit where pellets, similar to the ones we just saw being made, were fed into machinery that moved the pellets once again through piping with the force of heated air. As we observed shoppers ballooning out one after the other and being collected onto spinning reels, Ali Bhai and I stood surrounded by bags full of pellets to be used for production and reels full of shoppers to be used for consumption. Excuse me. So the work performed in spaces such as Umair's junkyard or warehouses and manufacturing units would be considered part of what the political economist has described as the informalization of quote-unquote relations of production and exchange in Pakistan. Based on largely 2 years of fieldwork conducted between 2014 and 2017, mostly in Lahore, but also other towns and cities in Punjab, specifically Gujarat and Gujranwala, which are both manufacturing centers, hubs in Punjab and central Punjab, which is this general area. This talk situates informalization within related processes of urbanization in Pakistan, where caste, class, and religious dynamics play themselves out spatially in cities like Lahore. In other writing, I have analyzed the set of relations, affective, spatial, material, that have organized and sutured together Lahore's urban landscape, thereby reproducing historical inequalities and interdependencies. More broadly, studying caste in Pakistan today requires first understanding Muslim nationalism in British India and the formation of Pakistan as a nation state, and second, caste-based dynamics in the historical area known as Central Punjab, which lies specifically between the rivers Ravi and Sutlej, which is the green circle right here, and has been a primary site for repeated interventions by colonial and post-colonial regimes. So both an earlier generation of scholarly work and more recent attention on caste amongst Muslims in South Asia and its significance for Pakistan history has emphasized the hegemony of the Ashrafia and a slightly different vein, what some have called Sayyidism. Among Muslims across South Asia, the distinction between Ashraf and Ajlaf groups has had lasting implication for how historical inequalities and interdependencies have have been inherited and reproduced across generations in Pakistan. Though having a pre-colonial reality, the term ashraf, literally eminent or exalted, was used by the colonial apparatus as a category for conducting censuses and ethnographic description, where it would reference patrilineal descent groups amongst Muslims akin to twice-born caste Hindus, but as I would like to emphasize, with the added quality of having presumed foreign ancestry, whether descent was reckoned through presumed Arab, Afghan, Persian, or Central Asian lineages. As such, the distinction between ashraf and ajlaf became critical to the ways in which the colonial state negotiated social, legal, and political relationship with Muslim groups, while ashraf elites, as a privileged class of Muslims, sought to legitimize themselves as the representatives of Muslims as a unified community in British India. Moreover, the hegemony that Urdu language and Urdu-speaking populations attained in the early years of Pakistan's independence tended to be inflected by the higher status accorded to the Ashrafia, especially ideals of respectability, sharafat, attached to the inheritances from Mughal courts of manners, dress, literature, aesthetic norms, and Islamic ethical traditions, akhlaq. At the same time, the hegemonic status of such elites would be contested following independence through public arenas, most prominently print, media, and literary forms, regional claims of community and autonomy, linguistic conflict, and social and economic mobility. In the Punjab, though overlapping with Ashraf and Ajlaf, the distinction between quote-unquote agriculturalists and non-agriculturalists index status attributions arising from differing relationships that groups had to ownership of land and ownership and control over land, the kinds of work and labor those relationships entailed, and the subsequent accumulation of power and status. This control is usually associated with agricultural castes like Jats, Arains, Awans, and others, which has given them access to state and non-state resources in terms of education, employment, and social status. Thus, in a recently published monograph by Amara Maqsood, she describes how in Lahore, an older middle class that had coalesced under the colonial regime expanded in the immediate post-colonial moment by virtue of their ownership of land, access to education, and state employment, while a new middle class has arisen since the 1980s, migrating from smaller towns in Punjab and residing in older parts of Lahore and finding employment in, quote, significant numbers in mid-level positions in the private sector or running small businesses, end quote. Both sections of Lahore's middle class are drawn heavily from Ashraf groups, as well as higher status Ajlaf ones who have historically controlled land in the countryside and maintain access to those same state and non-state resources. On the other hand, non-agriculturalists who would be considered low or non-caste or Dalit groups lacked control over land and were internally differentiated, engaging in a range of occupations such as sweepers, genealogists, barbers, leatherworkers, or weavers, but also providing agricultural labor, especially with regard to tending livestock, preparing fields, and harvesting crops. In fact, aside from those employed by the municipality who have been settled in Lahore for several generations now, very few workers, waste workers describe previous generations engaging in waste work, specifically the removal of night soil from the household of landowners. Regardless, in Lahore, sanitation workers employed by the municipality are almost entirely Christian, having converted from a non-caste Dalit group known as the Juda, and those working in the informal sector predominantly come from Khanabadosh, Pakiwas, nomadic groups, or other Dalit groups. Most prominent among informal workers were Musalli, who are usually described as Judas who converted to Islam, or Muslim junkyards. I would like to emphasize that many workers themselves describe being historically landless labor in the countryside, working under a variety of relations from servitude to tenant farming to wage labor with landowning groups who would be considered of higher caste backgrounds. In that sense, waste work, though certainly stigmatizing and marginalizing, should not be separated from other forms of power, status, and wealth, especially as it bears upon control over land and the condition of agricultural labor in central Punjab. So much of what is happening across Lahore's urban landscape, not to mention other urban centers across Punjab and many parts of Pakistan, thus bring together caste, class, and religion, which can be gleaned from urban spatial dynamics. So the materials described in this talk about informality, in a certain sense, provide a kind of economic infrastructure for urban life in many parts of contemporary Pakistan. And I'll return to that point in the conclusion of my talk. So the rest of the talk will examine the marked shift in contemporary renderings of informality. In these renderings, novel forms of exploitation have emerged in Pakistan and across South Asia, specifically contracting, subcontracting, and outsourcing. These forms of exploitation become the mechanism for generating surplus out of laboring populations. For Marx, the generation of surpluses through quote unquote the unpaid labor of others was interconnected to the exploitation of labor through the wage form. In informal economies, populations being unable to be absorbed into this formal economy as wage laborers are rendered into quote unquote surpluses and compelled to secure livelihoods in the informal economy, which is presumed to exist outside the capital labor relation mediated as it is by the wage form. Kalyan Sanyal, many of whom you may be familiar with, draws this distinction between accumulation and need in his own rendering of informality. For Sanyal, accumulation is just one circuit for generating surpluses within circulation, where such surpluses are created in production, realized through exchange, and directed to expand productive activities, that is, accumulate. Accumulation happens through a range of exploitative techniques, wage suppression, time and work discipline, technological investments, or subcontracting and outsourcing. The other circuit is that of need, where surplus is also generated and realized, but is deployed towards the quote unquote satisfaction of need and the replenishment of productive activity, not its expansion. The relations of work and exchange I examine in this talk are part of wider processes of circulation in which these circuits of need and accumulate converge. Rather than exploitation, these relations I want to suggest are better understood as ones of exclusion, in which, quoting Sanyal and Bhattacharya, the capitalist economy secures its resources minus the people who traditionally survived on it. This exclusion of people but inclusion of resources is similar to what the anthropologist Anna Singh has called peri-capitalist sites, where, paraphrasing Singh, quote, all kinds of goods and services are produced by humans and non-humans alike to be salvaged for capitalist accumulation. Here, I'm interested in waste work as reproductive in nature, whereby accumulation depends upon the appropriation of work and energy happening outside the domain of productive waged labor. We can have a more extensive conversation about this in the Q&A, but I simply want to emphasize that whether understood through salvage capitalism or circulation of surpluses, capitalist accumulation depends upon activities, relations, knowledges, and materials over which it does not necessarily have control. Many waste workers and junkyard owners, especially smaller scale ones like Umer, generate surpluses out of waste materials to meet needs, and aside for a few exceptions, do not engage in accumulation by expanding circulation. Yet, they are doing salvage work for supply chains directed towards commodity production elsewhere. So as one gets closer to capitalized sites of production, a shift towards the circuit of accumulation occurs. Surpluses generated out of things and persons can be directed into circuits of accumulation, where waste work appears to be salvaging for capitalism, or they can be directed into those of need, where waste work appears as a means of securing one's livelihood. The title of my talk, Figures of Surplus, highlight the range of things, that is waste, resources, commodities, money, persons, that is workers, junkyard owners, and middlemen, and relations of work and exchange that are dispersed across highly fragmented and differentiated processes by which surpluses are generated out of waste materials and work. There are 3 or 4 components at play in these processes that I will talk about now. 1 is remuneration and need. 2 is the scales of unequal exchange that bring together work and knowledge. And 3, payment and accumulation. Let me start with remuneration and need. So remuneration is importantly done for both materials and work. It takes multiple forms and consists of deserved recompense. There are 3 forms of remuneration for work only, or work specifically. One, of course, is salaries paid to municipal workers. There's also service fees that both municipal and informal workers get from private establishments. And then there's daily and monthly wages given to those working in junkyards and warehouses. Then there's remuneration for both materials and work. So those who sell these materials to junkyard owners separate garbage or trash, gachra or kura, from that which is considered profit, saving, remainder, surplus, gain, or excess. Budget was the term that was used. The latter materials, or budget, will pass through numerous sites like junkyards, warehouses, shops, and manufacturing units as they are accumulated, exchanged, and remade. Collecting, transporting, disassembling, sorting allows workers, junkyard owners, and middlemen to access the monetary worth of these materials and then exchange them for money. So municipal workers also tend to sell their waste to junkyard owners, though they're also given advance at times. Informal workers bring back sort of the leftover, the budget, back to their cluster of jhuggīān, as you can see here. Importantly, there's a gender division of labor going on where most of the sorting happening inside these jhuggīān are done by female kin for the most part, though female kin also go out into public space to collect waste at times from households. And then there's peri legane vale hawkers who go across urban and rural parts of the country and are sometimes work independently, but also are attached to junkyards at times. So that's sort of a systematic breakdown of remuneration, but of course, considerable variation exists in how that actually happens. So some workers hold on to sorted materials for periods of time, selling them on a fortnightly or monthly basis to generate income. Others hold on to them for even greater periods of time to take advantage of price fluctuations that frequently occur in these markets, though this requires a degree of financial stability. Those who are able to do this at time open junkyards because they can accumulate waste materials, allowing them to purchase from other workers and sell to larger junkyard owners or middlemen. Then there are those who have financial difficulties and sell most of their waste on a regular basis to cover daily domestic costs, such as food, rent, fuel, education, and health-related expenses. These calculations are, of course, shaped by and dependent upon disassembly and sorting done by female kin within these households. Despite moments of accumulation, much of the work and exchange at this moment is directed at meeting needs. Additionally, indebtedness is built into remuneration. I won't go into too much detail how these debts work. However, what I would like to highlight is first, many of these debts are to junkyards to whom workers sell their materials. And second, these debts bleed into an elaborate system of advances in which junkyard owners provide money as credit to waste workers on a regular basis. Many waste workers strategically use these advances to cover the everyday costs of running and maintaining their households as well, even if that same advance is a debt to be repaid. So remuneration here takes multiple forms: salaries, payments, cash payments, and adjustment of debts and credits. These dynamics of remuneration become major techniques for exercising limited control over the labor process, especially the initial collection and sorting of waste materials as a resource by workers. In the final section of this talk, I examine how remuneration and need shift to payments and accumulation as one gets closer to sites of commodity production and consumption. Before reaching that point, however, let me address the scales and relations of exchange created and maintained by junkyard owners and middlemen. So the kabāṛī, and to a lesser degree, the bīopārīan, are well-known figures across Pakistan and South Asia. Acquiring materials from one direction, workers, to sell in another direction, manufacturing units, these figures stand between and link the production of waste and the production of commodities. The exchanges they engage in articulate multiple spatio-temporal scales. The collection of waste from particular localities, their movements across the city, country, and region. Materials are also imported and exported, and wider networks of circulation, be they legal, informal, or even criminal. Junkyard owners and middlemen constantly negotiate the vicissitudes of these scalar processes, and unlike waste workers who are insulated from commodity production, which affords them a limited amount of autonomy and control, these figures are closer to and more dependent upon that production, which exacerbates their vulnerability to fluctuations in demand and prices for these materials. In the chapter from which this talk is taken, I speak at much greater length about how junkyard owners and middlemen actually entered this line of work and trade through some interviews. A few points to emphasize. Many junkyard owners have formed relationships over many years with waste workers who supply them with materials. So for example, the gentleman seated in the foreground here had a junkyard that accompanied these jhuggīān settlements, as the jhuggīān settlements were sort of dispossessed to the city's outskirts. So he's followed them over basically the past 2 decades. There's also considerable concern about the quality of the materials, which will become apparent soon, and the spatio-temporal scales of these exchanges. So mutual indebtedness extends across junkyard owners, middlemen, suppliers, manufacturing units, and beyond to those who sell manufactured commodities. This mutual indebtedness becomes a technique for one, navigating the uncertainty about materials and distress of persons, and two, exercising that limited control over the labor process. So the question really then becomes, if junkyard owners and middlemen have limited control over both the labor process of waste work and the production process of commodities, then how do they generate and realize surpluses? So sorting and disassembly are organized within within relations of unequal exchange, in which knowledge about materials and rates are jointly crucial to generating and realizing surpluses. Let me give you an overarching sense of how these unequal exchanges work, even though you may have gotten them from the vignette. Quite often, waste materials are collected in some undifferentiated way and then are progressively sorted and disassembled as they are brought into the production process. Surpluses in the form of profit is then realized from the minimal difference in the rate at which materials are bought and then sold. For instance, in one bīopārīan shop in Mystery Shah, which is a major junk and scrap market in Lahore, the most ubiquitous metal to pass through were various types of copper because of their ability to conduct electricity. Pipes, wiring, parts, and any number of items arrived from a variety of sources, whether small-scale industrial units or large-scale public utilities. They quite often came mixed with or attached to other metals, zinc, aluminum, silver, steel, and many more. These materials were cut so their insides could be inspected, scratched to reveal their coloring, cleaned to remove built-up dirt, or heated to detach one metal from another. Zubair, who was paid a monthly wage for working in the shop, explained to me that you can tell the kind of copper a material is by snapping it. He took wire cutters and snapped the copper wiring to reveal a brighter inner portion. If the copper on the inside is red, then this would be velati, foreign and pure. Zubair would call it 99.99%. If the copper on the inside was yellow, then it was desi, local, and was impure or mixed. No exact number was given. Along with color, relative lightness or heaviness was another quality through which different kinds of metals were recognized. Also, extra effort and or specialized knowledge was at times necessary to identify and prepare waste materials, which quite often involved the use of acids to prepare and identify all kinds of items. By buying materials that either came mixed or sorted ones at a lower price, junkyard owners and middlemen are able to sell sorted materials at a slightly higher price than that at which they were brought. These marginal gains are distributed across workers, junkyard owners, middlemen, and suppliers. Importantly, knowledge about these materials, especially their rate on local and global markets, is also dispersed across figures within relations of an exchange, within these relations of unequal exchange. Once again, there's no need to go into much detail about how this works, but as one gets closer to the site of commodity production, knowledge about rates becomes fairly well established. The further one moves from these sites of production, though, knowledge about rates becomes less salient, as there are other ways of making more gains. So sorting and assembly are ways of knowing and working with waste materials in which mental and physical labor are mobilized to recognize, evaluate, and standardize specific qualities of these materials and effect concrete and abstract transformations necessary for commodity production. Discarded things, that is plastics, paper, junk, or scrap, are not surpluses in any ontological sense, but are rendered as such by virtue of being routed into, quote unquote, the pale of value as commodities. These transformations are how surpluses are generated in production that are then realized in circulation through unequal exchange. So finally, as one approaches sites of commodity production, waste materials are increasingly treated as goods or mal in the possession of a junkyard owner or middleman. Unlike earlier where waste materials and work are remunerated with money, here waste materials as goods are transferred through the making of payments. The anthropologist Bill Maurer has described payment as, quote unquote, the act and infrastructure of value transfer. Maurer continues to put it in other terms, there may be a pyramid of money, but there's scaffolding and infrastructure extending from each level of the pyramid outwards and inwards, holding it up. It should be unsurprising that these payments straddle the lines between the accountable world of the formal banking center, regulated as it is by state fiscal policy, and the covert contours of informal exchange, articulated through its own notions of sociality and trust. Among junkyard owners and middlemen, rarely are payments done with an immediate transfer of money. Waste materials are almost always acquired by paying an initial portion of the total amount in cash, with the rest being promised on udar, referring to debt, credit, and or advances, and then being finalized with a check, bank transfer, or cash. Waste materials are thus given with the expectation that payment will not be completed immediately, but will be finalized at some point in the future. This temporal delay in payments arises from the fact that first, a complex system of advances and credits ensure the regular supply of these materials into manufacturing units, and two, much of the payments depend upon production and consumption of commodities. For instance, in the case of paper, book publishers in Urdu Bazaar in Lahore explained to me that wholesalers give advances to mills when putting in orders for a certain amount of paper that they will then use for producing paper goods. These publishers then went on to describe how the start of the school year will increase demand for copies, with production being ramped up just before them, and there being a marked increase in the demand for specific kinds of paper waste. In the case of plastic, the changing price of petroleum will impact the price of polypropylene powder used to make plastic pellets, and in the case of metals, price for these materials were set to the London Metal Exchange. So when goods are being bought and sold on an uninterrupted basis, rates for these materials remain uniformly high, and payments were carried out with limited delay across the supply chains. At such times, middlemen are comfortable purchasing more goods than they have money for, making up the rest through udar. However, when there is a fall in demand for consumable goods and rates drop, middlemen become hesitant about relying on credit or advances, which, if delayed for too long, become a burdensome debt. They still at times accumulate waste even when demand stagnates and prices have dropped, because there's an expectation that once demand rises, prices will also be pushed back up, potentially leading to even greater profit. Concurrently, junkyard owners coax middlemen into purchasing their materials because the materials they acquire need to be kept in motion to realize surpluses. As should be clear by now, these payments for goods become temporally protracted moments that are done through some combination of cash, checks, and/or bank account transfers. While surpluses are generated through sorting and disassembly within unequal exchange, as described earlier, they are realized in the form of money through the payment for goods, which can then be utilized to generate further surpluses and thus be crystallized as accumulation. The remunerations for waste materials and work to meet need examined earlier, and the payment for goods to accumulate described just now, are two connected, though distinct moments in which surpluses generated in production come to be realized through the circulation of waste materials and money. So just to conclude, the relations of work and exchange through which waste materials move are part of much larger processes, one that exceed informality as a site of economic activity and manifest themselves across Lahore's urbanizing landscape. Yet what exactly is that excess? For George Patai, excess was an overabundance or surplus of energy that, not dissipated through production, comes to be expended in, quote, a luxurious squandering of energy in every form, especially useless consumption, non-procreative sexuality, and modern warfare. The excess that remains of interest here are those forms of life that have taken shape in Pakistan, ones which are organized around historical inequalities and interdependencies along the lines of caste, class, and religion. Informality is an economic is a form of economic activity that draws upon and reproduces those forms of life as they have emerged over the past several decades. Waste infrastructures and economies in Lahore and across much of urban Pakistan have grown during this time, which have afforded opportunities for securing work and livelihoods for many actors, from households and waste workers to junkyard owners and middlemen. However, the position of actors within these economies are differentiated by circuits of need and those of accumulation. Being clear how these circuits differentiate their respective activities allows us to connect informality as a site of economic activity for generating surpluses and the concomitant forms of life that exceed them. Waste work is a social and political relationship that instantiates uneven forms of life across South Asia and more broadly. As Vinay Gidwani and Rajesh Reddy have suggested, two forms of life are implicated in waste. Quote, one that churns out growing quantities of waste and another that lives off this commodity detritus. As should be clear by now, consumption on unprecedented scales has shaped Lahore's demographic shifts, spatial expansion, and infrastructural growth, much of which has been oriented towards an economically and politically ascended middle and upper middle class. Yet what remains unclear in such accounts is how and why these two forms of life, ones that produce waste through consumption and those who make a life working with and exchanging these materials, operate alongside each other in intimately fraught ways. Informality thus becomes a critical site for maintaining those relationships between those forms of life. Relations of work and exchange generate surpluses directed at circuits of need, upon which workers depend for reproducing their own life and that of others, kin and non-kin. But other surpluses generated simultaneously are directed at circuits of accumulation, which junkyard owners, middlemen, and many others depend upon for reproducing their own life and that of others as well. Viewed from circuits of accumulation, relations of work and exchange are certainly salvaging surpluses for capitalism, thereby reproducing it. Viewed from those of need, those same relations are generating surpluses to reproduce life. Life, then, is the excess remaining after surpluses have been generated and realized through things and persons in informal economies. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you, Waqas. And at this time, we'd like to invite people to ask questions in the chat. Before that, I'll start with one question. So Waqas, I was wondering if you could flesh out for us a bit. It's hearing you talk about in your research, seeing how circuits of accumulation and circuits of need empirically overlap and led you to the end of this framework of exclusion of these waste workers who are generating surplus. Could you empirically kind of flesh out for us how these are either distinct sites of what's also been called corporate capital and non-corporate capital, or are they distinct approaches? And I'm wondering if figures like Umair and other junkyard owners, are there ways that over the course of their trajectory, do they experience upward mobility and then go in and out of these circuits and forms of accumulation versus need?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so I mean, they are, I would say that they're differentiated. I mean, they're slightly differentiated by like the site at which, spatially they are differentiated. But I think it's less the spatial difference between where need and accumulation is happening, which I kind of exploit in my own talk, where I talk about like the movement towards a site of production. So I'm using that, those spaces as ways of like differentiating things. But I think you're right in the sense it's a distinct approach to what, how you approach the surplus kind of, right? So if you're generating some surplus through, how waste workers sort of generate surpluses, and it's being directed towards not just the satisfaction of need, but also not the, Sanyal uses this term of replenishment of productive activities. So it's not, that's really what I say satisfaction of need because I think it makes, in a talk, it makes kind of like, concretizes it a little bit, but his idea is that the peri lagane wala, like he doesn't he engages in surplus to reproduce like the goods that he can buy and sell, and sometimes he may enter a circuit of accumulation. And so your point about upward mobility, I think, my research amongst like large scale junkyard owners and bīopārīs were pretty limited, but it seemed like, not limited, but I didn't do as expansive. I spent more time with a couple of junkyard owners and middlemen. So it seemed like people who could accumulate had other resources of capital to invest, to enter into this sort of space. Whereas someone like Umer is a separate example, but like the man I mentioned who was like following these jhuggīs along the way, I mean, he never really achieved the kind of upward mobility that would bring him into like Lahore's middle classes, right? He was still, I don't know, these categories are a bit fuzzy, but sort of working class or lower middle class, right? So it really some of this has to do with larger networks of accumulation these people are already part of. So Ali Bai is a perfect example of this, and I can, he was really, his family had, several businesses, and they just gave Ali Bai this sort of paperweight stuff to kind of take care of as the youngest child. So and the point about exclusion, I don't know, I can maybe come back to that. I think exclusion is spatial, but also kind of an approach to extraction that's different than like wage labor.
Thank you. So we have questions and comments thanking you for a fascinating talk from Whitman Barrett, who asks if you could please compare and contrast this contemporary waste market infrastructure with the ways that night soil has been historically collected and resold.
No, that's great. I don't know too much about the buying and selling of night soil globally, so I don't know the sort of mechanisms by which these relations work in exchange. In my research and in my book, I sort of, especially when I'm talking about sort of colonial Lahore and sort of the growth of certain kinds of state institutions around that, night soil becomes a really central kind of, that was the creation of like, at least, throughout colonial India, but also in other places. It's night soil and refuse, human waste, that's sort of the main ways that it sort of intervenes upon it. One aspect of this is these sort of sewage farms that were thought about. But what's interesting, that I've been thinking about in my work and as I've been writing more, is the relationship between this category of informal economies or informal relations, and then the use of, in the colonial period, custom or customary relationships, right? And those customary relationships quite often were actually caste-based kind of relationships, but also how contractual labor was meant to kind of incorporate that customary relationships into it. In a certain sense, the informal formal sector plays on that kind of distinction about what's sort of subject to sort of state contract and what's not. So so that's another sort of point of interaction that I kind of talk about in the book, but here, but I don't know the details of sort of how night soil was bought and sold and kind of, or these kinds of things. So, but no, it's a great question.
Yes, and we have a question from Nidhi Subramaniam. So if you could talk more about how debt relations, you mentioned how debt relations and bondage make the water economy, waste economy. Can you please tell us more about how caste is implicated and gets reproduced through these relations of debt and bondage? And I was also curious about the intercaste relations between Ali Bai and Umer and, bigger junkyard owners and smaller junkyard owners.
Of course. I think, no, that's, thank you for that question. In the context of, let's say, like contemporary waste economies, there's definitely a sort of, especially amongst informal workers, there's intense relationships of indebtedness between them and junkyard owners that sort of last over several years. There isn't, at least I haven't seen any sort of like, these older relations, debt relations that were present in the countryside, those same people become indebted to the same people as they enter waste works. I mean, that may have existed, I don't know. But what I did see quite often is, and I talk about this in another chapter, of how forms of indebtedness in sort of that are based in the agricultural economy reproduce themselves in sort of a city setting and sort of impact the trajectory of people, of waste workers into this line of work. And so, quite often those in debt, the many of the waste workers I did like life history interviews with spoke quite often about being settled on what's in Punjab, which is called Shamlat Zameen, basically public land, not public land, I don't know how to explain it, but common land and also wasteland. So they were settled on those and worked for sort of landowning groups. And so there's all these caste-based relationships of providing a certain amount of your produce to landowners and these kinds of things. I mean, some informal workers were actually indebted and came to the city sort of after undoing that debt. But then in the country, once they enter sort of the waste infrastructure, they become indebted through these kinds of advances that they're given, really. And in one case, they actually, in a few cases actually, to get access to a neighborhood, they took on other people's debts, basically. So there are, it's not a straight trajectory from, okay, here's some sort of caste-based debt that was in the countryside that's now exactly the same in the city. But the sort of, if you look at from what I glean from intergenerational sort of shifts, that indebtedness reproduces itself in a sort of a different form.
Yeah, thank you. So another question from Professor Alex Nading is about kind of overlapping with the earlier question I was asking you, wondering about how and where speculation figures in your formulation of informality. He's asking how need relates to aspiration and how brokerage depends upon readings of the potential value of waste.
Yeah, I mean, the potential, I'll sort of work backwards up, I guess. And so looking, the question about brokerage and potential value of waste, I mean, I think in a longer version of this, of the talk in the chapter, I talk about brokerage as sort of exactly this sort of ability to recognize potential value, to sort of also equivocate and lie a little bit, to play the system. I mean, there's so much of that going on that I don't really talk about in this talk, but the uncertainty around materials and people is like a site of potential value or extracting value or something along those lines. So I think brokerage is, and in the talk, in the chapter, it's brokerage is how I frame the work of a junkyard owner and especially, a middleman of bīopārīan. The question of need and aspiration is definitely there. And I think I in this talk, I set out the kind of the framework as need to understand these kinds of this kind of economic activity. But in a later chapter, I really I do address kind of aspiration, even though I don't use the term aspiration, and more talking about drawing on work by Beth Povinelli, but also some stuff by Veena Das and others, and sort of how these kinds of forms of endurance that happen, while at the same time all this exhaustion also happens. So this kind of striving that people, workers engage in to build and reproduce themselves, or the social reproduction figures more prominently there. This question of speculation, I haven't, I've thought about it, of course. I haven't necessarily tried to bring it to bear on my own work, though there's clearly some sort of speculative behavior going there. I mean, the speculation, if I were just to sort of try to formulate that and think out loud with that a little bit, would be around the sort of stuff, speculating on sort of market trends and prices and information about, if there's some sort of, for example, the price of powder, right, would be was constantly being talked about and speculated about, of why it's falling and shifting and these kinds of things. So there is this kind of speculative quality amongst these sort of traders and businessmen, but this larger scale speculation that's like attached to financialization with waste doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't, it's not that it doesn't make sense, but I haven't done that kind of stuff. But the I mean, I don't address it here really, but there is a speculation on land and the financialization of land in Pakistan. That's obviously the context for a lot of this, the spatial dynamics that I've been sort of tracing out. I don't know if that doesn't seem to answer your question, Alex, but that's sort of the best I could get to that. So, but thank you for that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Professor Chloe Aman, who thanks you again for your talk and says that she's really interested in the idea that surplus economies are infrastructural to capitalism, alongside the observation that they are necessarily covert. And she's thinking about scholarship on infrastructure that figures it as something that works best when not seen or otherwise sensed. And she'd love to hear more about the productivity of invisibility here, and is curious whether the formal invisibility of infrastructure sits in tension with the informality of the exchanges you describe. And I know personally that this is, central to your larger work about the conundrum with which waste work is essential, but also invisibilized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, no, and Chloe, thank you very much for that question. Part of obviously the work is, not rendering visible a certain kind of labor for the world. Like, I mean, that's not necessary, but trying to understand what these relations of work and exchange are doing, sort of in the sort of background or invisibility, and then this sort of what people call like infrastructural inversion, right? It sort of like comes out and appears to us. But I think how I approach this in like my the book and sort of just my thinking is that the category of informal itself is like a state-centric discourse on some level, right? It like produces it as you kind of use that term or whatever. And so, I mean, what I want to kind of show is that state institutions or state practices around waste are highly circumscribed. They have this sort of, they come at waste through, what others people have talked about, disposability, right? Like infrastructures of disposability. And so those are really powerful. And I think, but state institutions, for example, in this sort of situation, are central to how waste workers can also access waste materials in like household waste, right? Because of the governance stuff. So part of me wants to look at the invisibility, not necessarily as a problem of like, even though I think it is important to render that work visible at times, but also connected to kind of how does the state operate through this sort of managerial role over all of this, and that allows for what I sort of think around this sort of both infrastructures of disposability and circularity sort of like existing alongside each other, though in tension, and there's like conflict and these kinds of things all the time. So in that sense, that's where I see the productive invisibility, is that it allows two forms of like value generation to happen. One that's sort of more of like a governance type of thing, and the other being a more connected to sort of processes of circulation and commodity production.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. So I'll just, we're lucky to have Waqas with us for about another 10-15 minutes, and I'll invite more questions to come through the chat. We're inviting questions through the chat because of recording permissions reasons with uploading the recording and getting licensed. So I will read out Alex and Julia's comments, who both, again, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. And Alex responds with saying that he thinks that you're right, that aspiration is the wrong term. Endurance makes more sense. And he would love to think more about how speculating in materials and people and at a remove in financializable assets shapes worlds of waste, and is really grateful for your work. And so if you have more comments on that as we continue with the questions, you're welcome to comment more on that. I have, and we'll see if more questions come through. Another question, as you were speaking, I was thinking about another figure in South Asia who has talked about surplus and labor in the context of caste, which is also kind of important frame in your work, and in a different context, but you do start to talk a bit about the gender division of laborers in some of these waste work sites. So if you had any comments, Ambedkar in one of his early writings on caste talks about his idea of the surplus woman, and the surplus and the regulation of women laborers as distinct from male laborers, and things in terms of the productivity of women laborers versus male laborers. And he talks about this in the context of conjugality and sexuality and endogamy, and sort of the moral prescriptions that govern the sexual relations of women laborers who are so-called lower caste or Dalit, as distinct from those governing male laborers who are essential for the reproduction of certain unequal caste orders. And so he talks about how the surplus woman is the woman who, either through once widowed, is not allowed to marry again, is this excess woman whose sexuality has to be regulated. So I was wondering, I mean, it's not very directly related to your own area of interest and research, but in your field work, did you find that there were sort of different prescriptions and regulations around women's work in the generation of surplus versus
No, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of gender division of work, and especially how you just described Ambedkar's sort of insights on this are, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, in addition to sort of what I said, the kind of more ways in which sort of the labor of women is differentiated, is sort of devalued in relative to male wage labor, and I mean, and there's also this other kind of aspect of the labor in which the kind of labor male waste workers are quite often, like especially amongst in the formal sector, kind of the sort of feminization of the kind of waste work and male laborers. I mean, one space that I didn't necessarily do like work in is sort of domestic labor, right? And how much that is based off sort of caste and gender based work. There's within waste work, there were constant concerns around women waste workers entering into public, like working in public space as a sort of not a respectable kind of form, not like, yeah, against the norms of respectability that they attach to, women who did not work in public spaces or in these kinds of things, which I think is inflected by some sort of, I mean, definitely norms of respectability and domesticity. And so, but I think, I mean, part of the reason my limits on this is just like my access to women was extremely limited during my fieldwork. So I couldn't get, into the nuances of this stuff. And Lavid had a lot of what I rely upon is like men telling me stuff, so I, it's very limited in that sense, but I think you're absolutely right to sort of, the sort of, gender is a central aspect of how these sort of caste relationships operated or were maintained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. So we have a question from Dr. Tad. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but Waqas, you probably know how you pronounce Tad's last name, Skotnicki?
Skotnicki, yeah.
So he asks, and he says, thanks, Waqas. I was wondering about your use of unequal exchange in the context of informal waste. Is the exchange unequal in result or at the point of exchange? Or is the equality/inequality of exchange complicated by the temporal extension and elaboration of payment?
So, okay. That's a great question, Tad. I'll have to think about it a little bit maybe, but I guess my initial response is the latter, right? So the temporal extension and elaboration of payments, though that would like undercurrent the fact that it's unequal potentially. But I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, the initial, well, let me try thinking about this. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would have to think about it. I mean, I think there is something, but whenever the sort of exchange is completed, there is an unequalness to it. But even an initial point. So I mean, I think it's the unequalness comes purely from the ability for people to make different marginal gains on this. So they have to maintain some degree of difference between those two exchanges. But you're right to sort of like bring attention to how that temporal extension of the exchange allows for these marginal gains to be made, as well as maintaining the inequality of those exchanges. But I think I would need to think of, I mean, it's a very good question, but I think I would need to think about it a little bit more.
Thank you. So we'll see if more questions come in. I have another question. I was really struck by, and I think you led us there to think about some of these overlaps. But one of your last anecdotes was about the separation of vilayati and desi mal. And I was kind of struck by that metaphor as a way to refer to quality and value and kind of this differential assessment of value, but through the idiom of foreign versus is better, local is not good. And I've heard that in my fieldwork context as well. And so and then the earlier part, that foreignness and localness comes to bear in your talk is earlier when you're kind of laying out for us the kind of ashraf versus ajlaf. So groups and hegemony of ashrafia hegemony. So could you, I mean, I thought that was interesting. I kind of bring them together. Maybe they don't come together, but were there other places kind of in the sorting of waste materials and the assessment of value that you see these kind of social metaphors of inequity map on to assessments of value?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I don't think, I mean, the actual term, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the actual term ashraf in like my fieldwork at least was not prominent, right? I mean, people would talk about different castes, sayyids, or whatever the case may be, but not this idea of the ashrafia or ashraf stuff. But, I think, this is where the kind of, caste and class can be so interconnected in the ways that like, so in the waste, the quality of the waste materials, quite often people would talk about sort of class-based differences, right? That the kind of waste you get from a middle class or an upper class household is just so much higher quality than, the sort of kachra that you get from like a basti or something like that, So there is the way in which, but that didn't necessarily map onto the foreignness of like an elite household in Pakistan, right? Which, they may have these sort of foreign connections and these kinds of things, but not necessarily. I mean, the most spoken about foreignness in waste has to do with China, like just the way in which, quite often the narrative was basically amongst waste traders was that China's we're importing all our higher quality goods to China and getting all of their kachra basically to make stuff here. So with China, that's the only one that was very like vocalized as far as the waste material goes, as like basically an extractor of high quality materials and an importer of, really low quality past plastics basically. But it's interesting. I mean, I could think through this sort of like, yeah, that's the other time that you said that foreignness appears had to do with the sort of ashrafia and its connections to, its presumed connections to sort of these lineages.
That's really interesting. The China, Pakistan, like China is the place of
Right.
the vilayat and the foreignness, and and especially with the context of China, like investments in Pakistan, that acquires another dimension of something to think about. So Tad just elaborates on his question to say that he was thinking of Marx naturally, and the idea was simply that resultant inequality is essential to the accumulation of surplus value. So I was wondering if the parties involved see the exchange as unequal?
Yeah, I mean, I would need to maybe look through some stuff, but I think they do see, I mean, they wouldn't use the language of inequality, but I think they recognize that people are profiting. There's like all these forms of surplus value or profit happening, and they're aware of it, but they're just sort of, this is where the kind of questions of lack of control and autonomy become important, because I think and quite often the discussion in informal economies is how the sort of, I mean, not freedom necessarily, but the autonomy that informal economies allow you to engage in other kinds of activity or generating other types of income, right? It's sort of like control over your time. And so that's kind of where I see this, like, they recognize that people are profiting, but that doesn't really matter because it allows you to have other kinds of ways of generating income and livelihood sources.
Yeah, so another question I think that, is definitely part of the shaping the is part of the larger backdrop and landscape right now that your work is definitely going to be speaking to. And if you have any comments on, you talked earlier about questions of caste, class, and religion converging, and the question of, Muslim nationalism and the formation of Pakistan. And I know your broader work also kind of historicizes the location of this population in the Punjab and their assignment of sanitation work. So do you think you could talk more about how your work is speaking to and how you're drawing from work that's now looking at caste outside of India, caste outside of Hinduism, and how in your particular research site in thinking about sanitation and waste work have some of the predominant discourses that haven't really as seriously taken caste as the kind of axis of analysis and have prioritized religion sort of shaped some of the unequal and uneven relationships in your field site?
No, I think that's great. I mean, yeah, I've been thinking, as you probably, thinking about this quite a bit. I mean, I think part of, I think, one issue, one way that I've sort of thought about this is, quite often the debate, especially like previously, was whether Muslims have caste. And I think that's just not the right starting point. So it's not a question of like whether Muslims have caste or how is there caste in Pakistan. But if we take just the assumption that caste exists, right, and we can draw upon what different ways of thinking about caste, and then, how does that actually play out in Pakistan's history or its contemporary moment? That's sort of how I've approached it, like overall. I mean, one aspect of this is, having, there's two aspects to studying caste. I mean, one is to recognize how, like, understand how it works, and then the other is to sort of undo it, right, or abolish it, whatever, And so I think how I've approached it is, I mean, especially in case, I mean, even when you're studying waste in Pakistan, people will undercut you as being like, well, that's not caste, that's something else, right? So one part of the work is to sort of render visible. I mean, and I think this is where studying waste assumes I'm studying caste in a particular way, right? That like, oh, it's stigmatizing and it's so awful and this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking caste, I mean, I don't really talk about stigmatization and marginalization and sort of this purity stuff, but thinking about caste as organizing like the urban landscape, for example, right? Or organizing these informal economies, right? And when we think about caste in that way, it's not actually about waste work as a stigmatizing form of work, but as caste as this sort of, Yang talks about this sort of like social construct that's like infinitely transmutable, even though it's constantly referring back to its origins, right? And so that's sort of how I've approached it in a way to open up caste in Pakistan to questions of land distribution or access to state and non-state resources and these things, which other people are also doing that work now too. I'm not the only one, and I'm drawing on their work as well. But I think it's the discourse on caste is, and also, I mean, just one last point, I know we're running out of time, but like, if you look at like Hamza Ali's earlier stuff on class, you can read his work in ways that actually we can see how caste is operating in various things. So he calls the saladiyat amongst the Muslims and these kinds of things. He talks about Punjabi kinship. So there's moments in which caste does appear, I think, in an earlier kind of work on class, but a lot of that work has, a lot of work after that kind of just assumed that caste was this sort of Hindu-Indian thing. And yeah, anyway, so I have more to say about that, but I don't want to,
Yeah, hopefully we can have you back to speak more about this important question. And it seems to me that you're thinking more through caste mechanistically rather than, as Ambedkar says, caste as a mechanism, not only about its origins. So thank you so much for your time. And we really enjoyed learning from you today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Iftikhar, as well. And
Thanks,
Daniel.
everyone, for attending. And thank you, Waqas, for your very thoughtful presentation.